Hi Pioneers, this is Jen. I'm going to be doing my literature circle about a book called Hannah Divided by Adele Griffin. It's under the math content area. I knew that I wanted to read a book in the math content because I'm a math major. I didn't really know what to expect. I just found a book that was on my Kindle, so I was able to read it like this, and it was really nice. I got to highlight it as I went. But it was a book about a girl named Hannah, and there's just a quick summary about her and some of the characters. It takes place in 1934 in Pennsylvania, in a rural town about 30 miles outside of Philadelphia, which is another big city that's part of the book. And Hannah grows up on a dairy farm with her family. She has two parents, a grandfather who owns the land, and an older brother who does a lot of the farm work as well. Her oldest brother had just left, not really ran away, but kind of left to be just kind of explore the world. He wasn't happy being a farmer. So the family's been kind of devastated. They think it was crazy that he left. So Hannah leaving is what eventually happens, but it's kind of unheard of for people to leave this area. This is a place where you grow up and you stay there for the rest of your life. So Hannah's in a schoolhouse with 54 kids, and they're all different ages. She is illiterate, so she doesn't know how to read. She's kind of not seen as very smart, but she has incredible talents in math. They kind of think it's just counting. She can count very well. She counts everything she sees, but we eventually learn that she has skills in more than just counting, but also calculating and doing formulas and higher level math. But her school's not really challenging her. A woman named Miss Sweet comes from Philadelphia. She's very rich, and she originally comes to this schoolhouse to try to maybe donate some money to it, and it's mostly just to boost her own name, but she does seem very nice, very sweet, like her name. But Hannah is asked to stay after class by her teacher, and her teacher says, "This is our illiterate student, she could use your help." And eventually Hannah starts to show some of her counting little tricks to Miss Sweet, who is very impressed. So for example, Miss Sweet opens a book and asks how many B's are on the page, and Hannah just instantly says 47. She asks how many E's are in like 10 pages, and Hannah says 1,200 something. So she's incredibly talented at these skills that are very unique. Eventually, Miss Sweet goes to Hannah's house and asks her parents if Hannah can travel to a school in Philadelphia where she could be trained and improve a lot more in her reading and go into some higher level math, so that she could take some scholarship exams, go to a prep high school, and maybe even go to a college. Hannah's parents just think this is crazy. They refuse, and they do not let Hannah go. So Hannah runs outside, tells Miss Sweet to talk to her grandfather, and her grandfather has always been in support of Hannah. He's a math whiz as well. They always do math problems together. So he talks to Miss Sweet and says yes, and her grandfather is really the one in charge of all the decisions in the house. So she gets to go to Philadelphia. She ends up traveling there, and she's living in this house with a boy named Joe, who is just a year older than her, and he is a whiz in memorization. So he can read a book and then recite the whole thing back to you. And he's sort of her housemate. They don't really get along at first, but eventually he becomes her closest friend. The other person who lives in the house is Beverly, who is a bit older. She's about 18, and she is sort of a maid for the house, but she's also extremely talented in music and playing piano. So Miss Sweet lets her stay there as long as she continues to kind of do maid work, and she's still going to school to try to get a scholarship for her music. Now we quickly learn that Miss Sweet's not really around. She doesn't spend much time with the kids. She doesn't actually really care about them, but she kind of supports them so that she can get the credit for it. She wants to be known as someone that's charitable and have kind of more power in the city for being helpful like this. So Hannah starts going to school, and she doesn't really click with any of the girls. They think that she's very strange. She has a lot of quirks, and we start to see that it probably is somewhat OCD, just because she is very obsessive about numbers, and her favorite number 32, and compulsively does things like tapping, walking back and forth in the room, doing things a certain number of times. So a lot of the girls think she's very strange. They don't like her, they don't spend time with her, and they talk about her behind her back a lot. but it really doesn't bug Hannah. She spends most of her time studying, getting ready for the test at the end of the year, which will determine whether or not she gets a scholarship to move on to a good high school. So she's really just studying a lot. She gets to spend some time with Joe. They do a bit of adventuring throughout the city once they start to become closer friends. And Hannah is just kind of struggling with deciding whether or not she wants to stay at this school, especially when her grandfather dies. This is the person she was closest with. So she goes home for about a week, and it was only supposed to be a couple of days, but she just finds she can't leave. She goes to the funeral and spends back more time with her family, gets back in the swing of things with doing chores, and she's really missed being home. She doesn't really realize it until then. She gets back together with her old friends from her hometown, which is called Chance Ford, and she just spends time with them talking, and is really missing being home. So the decision to go back to school eventually comes when she starts to think about math again. She's about to go into calculus, and she really just starts to miss all of the hard work that she's been doing, and she takes the train back after about a week, does some more studying. Her OCD really increases with anxiety for the test, and eventually she takes that test, and by the end, she doesn't think she did very well, but at the end of the book, she goes onto a tree, climbs a tree, and starts to kind of relax a little bit, and she isn't so anxious anymore. She's not as stressed, and she just starts to think, I'm here to live and enjoy myself, and she has a little bit of fun. So we see a lot of growth there. She becomes a little bit more relaxed and doesn't really take so much value in whether she did well on the test or not. She just wants to, be a kid a little bit and enjoy the outside, which is a big change from her throughout the book. So Hannah goes through this whole journey, going to school, and the biggest point is that she's in 1934. It's very strange for girls at this time to be interested in math and even go into a career that would be more than just working at home. So she's definitely stepping outside of her comfort zone, showing a lot of strength, and she goes through a lot during this journey in terms of her adolescent issues, a little bit different than what most adolescents go through, but eventually she grows up a little bit as she becomes, as she finishes taking this test, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those different adolescent issues that she went through throughout this book. So in the book, Hannah has a lot of common adolescent issues that she goes through, and the first one that I want to talk about is physical developments. So this one isn't really as mentioned as it would be in a normal middle school book, just because Hannah is quite oblivious to her physical development. There's only a couple times where she really talks about what she looks like or what she's wearing or her hair. Her focus is so much on mental things that she doesn't really pay too much attention to it, but it still does have a big role in her life. There is one time when she looks into the mirror and has a kind of moment where she's looking at who she is and thinking about what she looks like, and she has a big fascination with movie stars. So there's this one point that I'm going to read on page 30. She bats her eyes and gives her best movie star smile, and she peered harder at herself. Her face, swamped in a quantity of pale, flyaway hair, looked soft and indistinct. She wished she were a more precise-looking person, with Joan Crawford's hurt, liquid eyes and a sly slink of Claudette Colbert, but the face in the mirror might belong to any girl. So she knows that she's quite average-looking and that she doesn't really fix herself up. There's a point when she's getting ready to go to school, and the only thing that she does is she just washes her face, washes her hands, and just puts on her uniform. She doesn't do anything else, unlike a lot of the other girls in her new school that she moves to in Philadelphia, where a lot of them get really dressed up. They buy all these new accessories for their clothes. And the first thing that she does when she meets these new girls at this new school, which its name is Otley Friends, is she wants to get a haircut. So she goes and gets her haircut, and then her friends are teasing her, not her friends, but the new people at her school are teasing her about kind of the way that her hair looks, saying, oh, wow, she got her haircut. But it really doesn't bother her very much. She kind of says, they're being mean, but it doesn't affect the way that she works in school, which I think is great, because a lot of times if you're in a school where you feel uncomfortable and the kids are picking on you for the way that you look, it starts to affect the way that you concentrate and focus in school. But for her, it really doesn't bother her in that way, which is great. Another thing is the way that she walks and the way that she presents herself. She does not realize that she is very cantankerous when she just kind of looks around, and very off-putting. um, there are people that are speaking to her and she's just staring at the ground, and she doesn't look at them or respond verbally when people ask her questions. And her friend Joe, who is her housemate in this house within the suite, he says to her at one point, when they're about to ride on a skateboard, he says, "You can't, and I've seen the way you walk. You can't look down when you're on this. You'll have to look ahead." And it kind of surprises her, but I don't think she realizes that when she walks, she looks down at the ground. She's counting her steps. She doesn't look up at the world and observe unless she's counting things that are around her, because she likes to count. So she is very different. There's not too much about puberty or just kind of her physical growth. She is quite oblivious to it, and she focuses more on her mind and school. At one point, there is a kind of discussion of the difference between girls and boys, where she's back at home when her grandpa dies, and she's talking to her friends, and they're asking, has she made any new friends, and she says no, she hasn't. And she wants to tell them that she has made friends with this guy Joe, who lives across the hall from her, but she doesn't mention it because she knows that they'll think that it's weird that her closest friend is a boy. So she really doesn't say anything about it, and she does realize that she can't say that it's that her friend is a boy, because they would think that that it's a relationship, and they wouldn't understand what it's like to just have her best friend be a boy. So the second part of the adolescent issues about social and emotional development is the biggest one one of the biggest ones that she's facing in this book. So back at home, she had quite a lot of friends at her old school in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. She had a lot of good girlfriends. They would spend time jumping rope. She was pretty close with her family on the farm. They would do housework together, milking the cows. The relationship there was a bit surface level, not very deep. But back at home, she had some very close friendships, and they had all these plans to get married in June, live down the street from each other. They planned out what kind of shelters they would have. They talked a lot about having a boyfriend, and they weren't really expecting to do much with their life and like step out and do any big things. They really just were thinking about how they were going to get married, where they were going to live. So that was kind of a big part of who she thought she was going to be. She didn't have big dreams for herself because her classmates did, and I think that is pretty common in middle schools too. If you have a group of friends who's very ambitious, all of them are going to start reaching towards higher expectations. But when you come across close friends where all the friends are just okay with just going by and not having high goals, then that can very easily influence each other. She was quite angry at her new classmates at this new school in Philadelphia for being mean, and she really didn't have close friends there just because they didn't get her. She would do her tapping, and she could be very defensive when they would ask things like, "Oh, you had to milk stinky cows." She would get very defensive about that, and she would be blatantly mean back to them about how like the cows wouldn't want to be milked by them, and she really didn't value friendships there. She just knew that they were quite different. They had different values. So I thought that was interesting that it didn't really bother her very much, because even though she didn't have a lot of friends there that had the same values as her of education and really like focusing on math and reading, it didn't really bother her studies. They did pick on her quite a bit, especially for the fact that she was illiterate. Once they found out that she couldn't read, she did get teased because she would be reading, kindergarten books. There was one time that she went to the movies by herself, and it was quite interesting because this was a book from 1934, so it was only 12 cents to see a movie. But she would be in the movie, like standing in line, and two girls from her new school would be in the back talking about her. And she tried to act as if she couldn't hear, but they were just saying mean things about Hannah when moving by herself and how she was always tapping her hands. So even though it did seem to bother her a bit, it didn't hurt her ability to work well in school. For her family, they lacked a lot of support for her. The only person that she really felt close with was her grandfather, because he understood her her joy of math, and he really valued her abilities. They would always do word problems with each other, math problems. So she really felt close to him, and I got frustrated a lot by the lack of support that her parents gave and that her teacher gave. And I guess I understand it because it is 1934 and a girl who wants to go into math but she's illiterate, you don't see much of a future for that. But her grandfather having hope for her was really the only thing that pushed her. She even said at one point that she was only going out of the only reason why she went out of the state was because her grandfather wanted her to. So that he really pushed her a lot and gave her a lot of support, and she really needed that. She could have been quite untrusting of adults because they tended to use her as well. For example, Miss Sweet, she really only wanted to boost her own image, even though she would act as though she was helping her. They would show off her tricks, where at one Thanksgiving party, she asked Hannah to take out a book and count how many E's there were, and there were like 1,000, and she counted them in under a minute. So they wanted to kind of show her off, but it wasn't really celebrating her talents. It was more of just Miss Sweet wanted to boost her own image. So I could understand why Hannah would be a bit untrusting of the adults, especially because they weren't really there for her all of the time. But her closest friend at Otley Friends was her teacher, her math teacher. He was quite quirky. He had one glass eye. He didn't dress. He dressed like he tried to dress professionally, but his clothes were all dirty and there's coffee stains on them. But he was who she spent most of her time with, and he was part of the reason why when she went home and she was kind of conflicted of whether or not she wanted to go back to school, he was what she would think about her teacher at Otley Friends, and that's the reason why she wanted to go back, was because she wanted to learn more and get to calculus even as a 13-year-old. Another just part of that with the social and emotional development is her emotions. She really didn't show emotions too often. She didn't express herself very well, and I think that that's kind of something that Christina was talking a bit about with Colin in Abundance of Catherines. He would express his emotions all the time, show when he was angry. Hannah definitely didn't do that. She kind of bottled them up. If she was sad, she would just kind of keep it inside. She just didn't express herself very well, and I think that that's just part of her personality. And I wondered as I was reading it, she might have Asperger's syndrome, just because she didn't really understand how she was putting herself out. She just wouldn't really talk to people. She was very internalized of everything, but it's so great because everything that was internalized was incredibly intelligent. She had such great smarts. But she definitely did not show her emotions in a very outward manner. Now, I've been waiting all this time to talk about the cognitive development of her because she was just fantastic in her cognitive developments. Definitely a wide range of abilities for her. Her math talents were phenomenal, and I wish that the author spent some more time showing some of the actual math, because the author did say, Adele said, she was very good, she whizzed through all of the math, but there was never actually talk of what the math was. They didn't actually go through any of the algebra or geometry, and I kind of wanted to see that as a math person. I wanted to see how that would be put in there and what actually she was doing. But we got the point that she was very talented, and she was very able to get a scholarship because of how well she could do in all of this math. Back at home, when she lived at home on the farm, she did all of the money work, everything with taxes, she did it all, and she was just a 13-year-old. So in terms of reading and the help that she was getting with her literacy, she was starting to improve a bit back at Otley Friends, and it wasn't necessarily because she had a better teacher who spent more time with her. That was probably part of it, but Joe was helping her a lot. They would sit down and read this newspaper kind of scrapbook that he made of a bunch of newspaper articles of some of the robbers that he really looked up to, and she got really into it. And she would go, when she went back home, she was like, "Oh, I'm following the story of these robbers and criminals," and her family was confused and a bit angry that she was interested in it. But she found something that she enjoyed reading about, and I think that in our classrooms, I might deal with this a little bit, not so much as math, but if we have kids who just are struggling with reading, it's finding what they like to read, because some boys, they might find that they like nonfiction, more than fiction. I've read that before, and that's why you want to put a big variety of reading materials in your classroom, rather than just having, she was just trying to read like picture books and just like storybooks, but Hannah found that she read a lot better when she was reading these newspaper articles, and she could pick out words more and follow them more because it was something that interested her. And I also noticed that her reading disability is something similar to a story that Dr. M told us, at least in our class in 212, about a student that she had that when he would read a sentence or write a sentence, it was just jumbled. There were some capital letters, some lowercase, everything, there were no spaces, everything was written just as one big clump. And that's how Hannah saw things. She saw things just as a bunch of random letters. They didn't really mean anything to her. She saw the patterns in them, which some people, as she went forward in this book, her math teacher said, that's okay. You see things as patterns. That's great for your math abilities. No, it's not as good for her reading that she doesn't, she can't really break down a sentence and understand the different parts of it. She can see the patterns in it, which is why she's so good at math. So, some of these reading disabilities that our students might have, whether it's like Hannah's where she can't break apart the patterns in the letters, or just like other kinds, seeing how those could possibly be a strength would be something good to think about. How if no one took the time to see how Hannah's abilities and patterns were so fantastic for math, she might just still be sitting at home being illiterate. So I hope that as a teacher I can find my students' weaknesses and help them see how they could be strengths. Another strength that she had that was never really mentioned, but I noticed it, when she listened to stories, she could visualize them very well. There was one time where she was sitting with her friend back at home listening to the radio, and that was kind of their way of watching TV back then, was listening to radio shows. And there's a story about a witch being told, and Hannah had to turn it off because she visualized it so much. She said, I could see the witch right in front of me, I could see its warts, and I could see the way it looked. So she could visualize these things that were said out loud extremely well. So even though if she were reading it, she wouldn't be able to visualize it, if she could hear it, she would be able to. So when I teach, especially for math, I want to give them the visual, writing on the board of all the different geometry aspects, but also make sure I'm speaking it as well, make sure that I'm describing things out loud, having it written down, just as many ways of providing the information as possible, because those different types of learners, it needs to be able to be applied, and that's definitely talked a lot in chapter 3 about the different ways that our students will take in information. So I definitely want to make sure that I'm catering to all of those. There's a big change in the school environment that she goes through. So her first school it was 56 students, and those rows were all divided up. She didn't get much individual attention, one teacher for 56 students. I mean, that's not really our ideal sense of a school. But when she goes to other schools, she's doing almost all one-on-one tutoring. She is having all different times of the day. She has students talking to her individually, or teachers talking to her individually, sitting down and working with her through her own personal problems with reading and helping her extend past in math. So she gets to work at her own speed, which is a big change from where she's just at her old school in Chads 4, where she's just going at the same speed as everyone else, whether they're in first grade or high school. So she's getting a lot more personal attention, and that's something I'm going to look for in a school when I'm doing interviews and trying to find a school that's right for me. I can't imagine being in a school with way too many students per teacher ratio and not enough time to work with students individually. I'm really excited for my student teaching because I will have time during two or three different prep hours where I'll get to work one-on-one with students and of course prepare myself, but also I'll have that time where students can come into my area and ask me questions and kind of go over things individually with them. So I think that's so important. Some students need that one-on-one attention. I know that I definitely thrived when I had a teacher sit down and talk to me one-on-one rather than just sitting in class. So I could see why she grew a lot when she had that attention to her in class. So her cognitive development is very unique. She definitely had some strengths that other students didn't have. Some of them saw it as strange, but she had teachers that were able to use those strengths that she had and get her into a good exam for possibly a scholarship. So Hannah's moral development was really interesting because she seemed a lot more mature than some of the other 13-year-olds I could think of. And I think that has a lot to do with the way that she grew up. Back at home, she had to take responsibility for everything she did. She woke up at 5 a.m. every day, went outside, milked the cow, did chores around the house. When she got home, she was expected to go right back into the backyard and do chores again. She never questioned the amount of work that they had to do. She just accepted it and knew that that was part of getting her family to succeed, have enough money, do well. So I thought that was really cool, and it definitely passed along to when she went to Chad's Ford. There was when she was in the house back with Miss Sweet, someone said to her that she needed to wake up at 7. It was Joe. He said to her she needed to wake up at 7, otherwise she'd be late and it would be awful. And she's kind of laughing in her head, thinking, I woke up at 5 every day. If I woke up late, I would have gotten in huge trouble back at home. Of course, I'll be up on time. So she took complete responsibility for her homework and her schoolwork, for all the chores that she needed to do back at home. And she was surprised at how little she had to do at Miss Sweet's house, because she was used to cleaning up after herself all the time, and doing all of the work to on the farm. So she was surprised that she had so much free time at home and didn't have chores to do on Saturday and Sunday. She needed to wake up early. It was a big kind of shock to her, and that shows a lot about her character, that she was very responsible, very taking charge of all of her work that she needed to do. There were some little times where she would act like a 13-year-old, for example. With Joe, her and Joe didn't really get along all the time. They started to grow to be closer friends, but right at the beginning, she didn't like him, he didn't like her. He called her milkmaid, and she didn't even say a word when he was speaking to her. And they started to pull these little pranks on each other. When he was being kind of rude to her, calling her a milkmaid, that night she took some Vaseline and put on a doorknob. Then later, he went into her room and messed up all of the objects that she had used a ruler to line up perfectly on her dresser. So they just started to play these little pranks on each other, and I think that's they were almost harmless. There was one time where she put some food into his shoes, and he had to clean those out. So for the most part, they were quite harmless. They were just a way of kind of messing around with each other. But it does show that she was just capable of having a little bit of fun, which I enjoyed to see. With her decision making, she was very wise, I think, and it was very difficult for her to make the decision of going to Philadelphia because her family did not support it. They thought that it would be stupid for her to want to go into math, but she stuck with it, and that was very hard for her to do, but it definitely showed that she was being courageous with her decision making, and she was being a little bit more open-minded than her family was. When her family heard about this opportunity, they just turned it down instantly. They didn't even think about it. But Hannah spent some time thinking and just decided that she needed to do this. She needed to spend time with math because that's what she'd like to do. So I thought that showed a lot about her character and her ability to stick to her guts and to talk to her grandpa about this opportunity. So she had a lot of experience with stepping outside of her comfort zone and going against the grain, going against what her family suggested, and even against what the whole town suggested, and doing something for her. She stayed very strong in her beliefs and values when she was in Otley Friends School. She didn't change to try to fit in. There was one time where everyone was invited to a Halloween party except for her, and she was a little bit sad, but she didn't do anything to try to get invited. She didn't try to change the way she looked or change the way she acted. She just kept focusing on math. It was what she invested all of her time into. She was told by her mom to restore her faith each week by going to church on Sunday, and she didn't seem to do that, which I thought was interesting. She was starting to think for herself, which that's a big part of this age, is they're going to start creating values for themselves and doing things that they find to be important. And that's what I thought was so great about Hannah, is that even though she was living on her own now, basically, she didn't really have much of a guide or a role model. She was still doing things that she thought were important. So it's succeeding in school and math, and having a little bit of fun on the side. She was doing things that she valued, which was very great for a 13-year-old. I can imagine that some of the students that are 13 and are 8th grade and freshman year of high school, they might not be that strong. They might not have that independence and say that they know what their values are and stick to them consistently. So I thought that was really interesting that Hannah was able to do that so well. So this literature circle turned out to be a lot longer than I had expected. But the last thing that I want to leave with is saying that Hannah faced a lot more difficulties than most 13-year-olds do, and she came out of them very strong. She to kind of talk a little bit about what her OCD was like, even though it was never officially stated. She just had crazy obsessions with the number 32. It was her lucky number, but she would do everything in 32s, especially when it came time to take the test. She would walk back and forth in her room 32 times every time she walked into her room, and every time before she left. She would tap the corners of each page 8 times, so there were 4 corners. She would do it 32 times. She would blink her eyes 32 times. Really everything was surrounding this number 32. And they got, these obsessions got a lot stronger as she got closer to the exam time. So when she had this big test, she was, the OCD was just growing and growing, and she got more anxious for the test. And it's just interesting that no one really noticed what she was doing. No one really paid much attention to her compulsions. No one tried to stop it in any way. She annoyed people sometimes. A lot of the kids in school didn't like her because they said she was always distracting them when she was tapping the page. And she was just kind of on her own with it. She didn't really have much support. And I just wonder if Hannah was growing up today, how that would be different, how teachers would pay more attention to a student who's tapping. And I think we have that a lot in our classes. We have students who are always tapping their pen, or always making noise, and we find that to be annoying, and sometimes we'll just walk over and tell them to stop. But how else can we go about that? How can we find what the bigger problem is? I think that's so important to remember, is that sometimes we just think of these things that our students do as annoying or distracting, but it might be something deeper. They might have anxiety, they might have OCD, and they can't actually stop themselves from tapping because it's an obsession of theirs. So that's just something to consider, I guess, with their students, is to always remember that there could be something deeper going on, whether it is with something like tapping or even just an emotional problem. If they seem sad, it could be something deeper going on in their life. So always remembering that. And just overall, this book was really interesting. I didn't expect what happened because I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what it was about going into it, but I definitely enjoyed it. I thought that Hannah's journey, kind of becoming more of a later adolescent, like an adult, becoming more mature, even though she was still 13 throughout this whole book, she definitely grew a lot. She gained a lot of knowledge and a lot of moral development as she became more responsible and more self-assured, maintaining her confidence, and just really growing a lot. So I enjoyed this book, and I'm excited to talk about it in the discussions.